This is the second video looking at how we learn and what teaching tips we can draw from this for the classroom. The second idea is that factual knowledge must be stored before skills can be learned. By this, I mean that to use skills, for example, analysing data, you obviously need to use working memory. But to think this through, you need to know the facts beforehand. The brain naturally chunks information if it sees anything that has been learned before. Here's a demonstration to help explain the point. Read the following list of letters once, then pause the video, look away, and try to write down as many as you remember. Okay, how many did you get? The average for this is 7. Now let's look at this next list and do the same task again. Pause, look away, and write them down. Depending on your background knowledge, you probably remembered more from list 2. That's because the space in your working memory doesn't rely on the number of letters, it relies on those letters having some meaning. The advantage for this for learning is obvious. If students can chunk information together, there will be more room in their working memory to think and for new information to be quickly understood. Background knowledge is vital for chunking and fast understanding to take place. This ties into the third idea. Background knowledge and vocabulary are essential to reading comprehension. Pause the video and have a read of this passage. Now, if you're like me and not familiar with the sport of baseball and the vocabulary specific to this sport, this passage is very difficult to comprehend. However, if someone plays, watches, or has been brought up around baseball, it's a familiar pattern, and it's a part of the game called a double play. A number of studies have been shown that people understand what they read much better if they have a background knowledge of the subject. Part of this is due to chunking. One such study showed that poor readers with background knowledge of a text can outperform readers with no background knowledge. This links to vocabulary. The more words that students are familiar with, the more likely they will understand the text. The fourth idea I want to highlight is a basic one, but not always something that we consider when planning lessons. People remember what they think about. If you don't pay attention to something, it won't be learnt. But more specifically, it's how students think of the learning that determines what ends up in working memory. Willingham writes that trying to make learning relevant can be detrimental. It can focus thinking on the wrong thing. This is because if it's different from putting something into a context students understand. This is very helpful and uses their background knowledge. But focusing a lesson on a gimmick simply to make it more interesting or relevant for students won't direct their minds to the learning steps, it will divert it away. As previously mentioned, students just need to see a lesson as both challenging and achievable to buy into the lesson. The fifth learning point is that people remember stories particularly well because they make us think. Memorable stories focus on a problem and a conflict that has to be solved. Within the story, there are ambiguities or clues that the brain has to decipher and work through. The brain naturally pays attention to the conflict and wants to understand how it's resolved because we are naturally curious. So let's look at what tips we can take from this to support teachers in the classroom. Firstly, get children to experience as much as they can and to read as much as they can to build their background knowledge. Secondly, the more words children know, the better their understanding, and the same for all people. So teach vocabulary explicitly and as often as you can so students build their inner word banks. I'll do a separate video on best practice for this. Next, review each lesson plan and determine what students will likely think about. Use attention grabbers with caution. Will it direct students thinking towards a specific learning point, or will it divert their thought process away? Direct instruction models ensure students think about the right things and benefits all students. And lastly, pose the learning as a conflict or a question to be answered, like the problem in a story. As an example, try changing learning objectives such as to be able to use subject pronouns in a sentence to a learning question like, what is a subject pronoun?